also I did have to sort of navigate from the age of 4. Why am I being punched in the head every day? I better learn to fight back. Why am I not allowed in? Oh, she's a lovely girl, but we can't have that kind of girl in here. What would the neighbours say? All of that sort of...
So you wouldn't get invited for tea?
Exactly. I mean, you would get to some houses, but then there are other houses where you'd have to get out before they got in from work, all that sort of stuff. So it's how do you square that as a child, and how do you... I reflect on things where I remember consciously going, right, I'm going to show this person my book of Beatrix Potter's Mrs. Tiggywinkle, and I'm going to read it to them because I'm only 4, but I can read and I want to show them so they'll like me. All those sort of things. So part of you goes, precocious little swit, there we are. And then another part of you goes, why are you even thinking like that? So it's that sort of stuff that I'm interested in interrogating.
Let's talk Richard III, which is your current project.
Yes.
You're known for loads of other things, but we'll focus on a bit of Shakespeare to start with.
Thank you.
Now, why this play? It has obviously a central character who is, to say the least, well, a bit misunderstood. What would you say?
Yes. So I absolutely think that is why I fell in love with this play. When I was a kid, I was given a book by my Auntie Lois, my mum's younger sister, called The King's Grey Mare by Rosemary Hawley Jarman. The King's Grey Mare is Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville marries Edward IV. She is Richard III's sister-in-law, and she hated Richard.
Yeah.
There's a companion book that I found in the school library called We Speak No Treason, which is from the first act of the play Richard III. And that book is the same story as The King's Grey Mare, but all from the perspective of people who love Richard. So King's Grey Mare, they love Elizabeth. We Speak No Treason, they love Richard. And somewhere in the middle is probably the truth, or their truth.
Most people who hadn't read that book, and I looked it up this morning, it's still around. It still absolutely enchants a chunk of people who can't get enough of it. But it was all new to me. I knew nothing about it. I just think of him as an evil so-and-so who killed those poor boys in the tower.
That's the PR that worked successfully. So when I first read Shakespeare's play, I was outraged because I'd grown very fond of Richard. I think because I grew up in the Cotswolds in the 60s and early 70s. Me, my dad and my brother were the only people of colour for a bajillion miles. So for me, I really identified with Richard. And when I read the play, I was a dweeby kid. I'm reading Shakespeare. I haven't started secondary school yet.
But I'm getting that vibe from you, actually.
Yeah, dweeb.
Yeah. Okay.
Major dweeb. And
I'm thinking we could have been friends.
Yes. Thanks, Fee. Very bad at sport, very enthusiastic, but very bad. Swatty, silly voices, that was sort of my forte.
Can we just name the village where you grew up? Because I looked that up too. It's quite obscure.
Wickwar. Wickwar near Wootton Under Edge and Chipping Sodbury, near Stoloffish Stroud.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So that's our other alumni from the village is a woman called Catherine Johnson who wrote Mamma Mia.
Wow.
There you go.
Not bad.
There's something in the water there.
There
isn't
certainly
there?
is. There certainly is. And we're still pals. We survived our childhoods. So Richard III for me was a character I identified with on the tip of why are they being mean to him? It's not his fault how he looks. Why can't people just see if he's a nice person or not? That was absolutely my take. And here I am several decades on, and I think that childish sense of what's fair and not's fair sticks with us at some level. So I've always loved this play because when I first read it, I was outraged that Shakespeare made him out to be such a meanie. And such a bad person. But I also reasoned, Shakespeare's writing for Elizabeth I. He's a freelancer. You've got to stay in with your paymaster.
How true that is.
Elizabeth I is the granddaughter of the man that deposed Richard III. Of course, the rep is going to be that he was a baddie and hooray for my granddad. So I love this play because although Shakespeare does do the badness in it, who does he have speaking to the audience? Richard. Richard has lines about why doesn't anybody love me? Why doesn't my mother love me? I'm not lovable. Maybe I am lovable. And there's something about a person's sense of themselves being sort of swamped and distorted by the judgment of the society around them that can then be internalised. So you start to hate yourself. That I really resonated with. And so I wanted to posit the question, what happens when somebody who's been punched down upon for long enough decides to punch up? And that's sort of where the play lies for me.
So all of that makes perfect sense when you're explaining that to us now. But how, if you don't change anything in the original version, can you know that you're getting that across to an audience?
Well, that'll be the gig of the production. For me, it's about you lift up and you heighten those elements that you want to resonate with the audience. You make a relationship with the audience. You know, when you're invested in someone, it's harder to hate them and much more easy to try to understand what's happened to them. The way we'll set up and structure early parts of the show will give you that sense of this character who's been marginalised and othered. And then, frankly, you just let the language do its work. I mean, some of the things people say to him are fairly gobsmacking, not least his mother. Two mirrors have gone and there's one cracked mirror left and that's the one I'm left with, and, you know, I should have strangled you at birth. I mean, there's a whole... She goes for it. Good mothering, she has not.
No. What was his disability?
In shape, you know, he's called crook-backed and a toad and all sorts of things in the show. But he had a very slight scoliosis, they think, something that might not have even been visible to the eye. He was in real life, he was a valiant warrior. He was known for his feats of arms and stuff. So he was physically very capable. But for the purposes of a good yarn and to stay in with your paymaster, he became sort of this malformed, malignant character. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is body pathologizing, where you decide, oh, this body in our society is the body that we think is unacceptable. So this is the body that we say has malignant, malign intentions ascribed to it. So it might be a black body, it might be a differently abled body, it might be an albino body, it might be a masculine presenting female body or a feminine presenting do you know, pick your poison, anything you like. But it's the same, you can use the same structure of sort of derogatory attitudes and exclusion and that sort of hostile othering, and the conclusions come out the same. So obviously in our production, I'm not playing Richard as a differently abled person. I'm just being black in an all-white society. So and that's part of why I've bunged it into the Cotswolds. So we're taking a bit of my childhood. And my brother's composing the music for it, and which is lovely.
You are the only person of colour in the cast, the only person we'll see on stage.
Yeah. And
that you believe is a genuine reflection of the Cotswold world in which you grew up.
It was a fact that it was us. It was the three of us. You know, loads of things about my childhood were absolutely brilliant. I wouldn't have missed a second of being able to walk for miles through fields or have adventures or get stuck up a tree and have to get myself out, you know, all of that. I can milk cows by hand if called upon to do so. So it was a really sort of free, it was that go out the front door in the morning with your sandwich and I'll see you at tea time childhood.
People say that. Did you really
literally
do that?
Did do that?
Did you?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. It was free and wild and fabulous. You can't get that stuff back. But it also, I did have to sort of navigate from the age of 4. Why am I being punched in the head every day? I better learn to fight back. Why am I not allowed in? Oh, she's a lovely girl, but we can't have that colour girl in here. What would the neighbours say? All of that sort of.
So you wouldn't get invited for tea?
Exactly. I mean, you would get to some houses, but then there were other houses where you'd have to get out before they got in from work, all that sort of stuff. So it's how do you square that as a child, and how do you, you know, I reflect on things where I remember consciously going, right, I'm going to show this person my book of Beatrix Potter's Mrs. Tiggywinkle, and I'm going to read it to them because I'm only 4, but I can read and I want to show them so they'll like me. You know, all those sort of things. So part of you goes, precocious little swit, there we are. And then another part of you goes, why are you even thinking like that? So it's that sort of stuff that I'm interested in interrogating.
And what do you think would be the experience of that young girl growing up in the Cotswolds now? How much would genuinely have changed?
Well, some things will have changed. I mean, you know, think back to the 60s and 70s telly. It might be Mind Your Language or Love Thy Neighbour, or those would be the times where you'd see a person of colour on. Or it might be Charlie Williams being hilarious, or it might be Jim Davidson with his chalky white jokes, or all that sort of stuff. So we don't have that in the same way now. That we're more media savvy and everybody's on their phones. The world is wider than it was then. But at some levels, I mean, we've just had the girl who was beaten up in the playground, haven't we? The black girl that's beaten up in the playground and by some of her white classmates, and nobody intervened. So, it continues in a variety of forms. And so I still think it still has a resonance. We have, what did we have the other day? People protesting outside the hotel where the migrants were.
That was in Liverpool, of course, which
Yes.
is where your mum is from. Your dad was born in Ghana, is that right?
My dad's from Ghana,
Yeah.
born and grew up.
Yeah, and your mum's from Liverpool. So,
Yes.
and this play is going to be premiered in
At the
Liverpool,
Playhouse.
At the Playhouse.
Yeah.
Liverpool, where I grew up, is not a place without racism.
No, well, it's a port city.
Yeah.
How would it not be? Yeah. Yes, Toxteth, Liverpool 8. There was in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of rioting going on up there, and all the interface of communities and racism was very powerful then, and no doubt there are still elements. Well, as we know, yes, as you say just now, there are still elements of that now. But I'm very glad to be opening in Liverpool, because the other side of my stepfather said when he went to spend a week in Liverpool with Mum, they went up there for a visit. After a week, he said, "Okay, now I understand your mother." In that, sit next to my mum for 5 minutes, she will have your life story out of you.
Yeah.
And there is something sort of open and garrulous and embracing about that sort of.
There's all of that,
Yes.
but there's bad stuff too. I mean, listen, Fee knows damn well I'm always here to say good things about Liverpool, but I'm also acutely aware, or I've become more aware as I've got older, that it wasn't always a good place for people of colour to
Yes.
have lived.
But I mean, I think you could probably take any part of the country and say the same. I mean, I know that one of the reasons that we moved to the Cotswolds was because my father was working for British Aerospace based in Bristol, and when he'd first come over in the late 50s to England, he'd gone to stay with a cousin or a friend who lived in Bristol on City Road, and he'd experienced the way children of colour, particularly black children, were educated, and there was a large percentage of kids who were sent to educationally subnormal schools, as they were charmingly called then. And so when then we moved to Leeds, hence my love of Leeds United Football Club, have to get that in. But when we moved back, we could have moved back to Bristol, but his sense was I'd quite like my children to be educated somewhere where the assumption wouldn't be that they might probably go to an educationally subnormal school. So he plopped for the Cotswolds instead.
And how did you find school with your dyspraxia, which you didn't discover you actually had until was it your daughter who was diagnosed with it?
Yes, I thought she was developing perfectly normally, like her mother. That is, she's talking at 9 months, but not walking till 18, and doing a lot of pulling the rug with a thing on it towards her, which I thought was just, well, that's very smart.
She sounds gifted to me.
Exactly, thank you. Yes, so what was... The whole thing about the dyspraxia thing was, I mean, if it was identified as anything, it was, she's got clumsy child syndrome. But my uncle played rugby for England at the time, number 8, Andy Ripley, and my mother was my games mistress. So on the one side, superbly gifted on a sort of coordinated level, and on the other side, tripping over her shadow. So as I say, I was very enthusiastic about sports. I love sports, just not very good. So quite often, when you'd get picked for teams, it would be me and the girl with bottle lenses left at the end.
Do you know what? We definitely would have been friends.
Thanks.
Childhood. But I suppose what fascinates me about that, though, is that you've chosen a career that involves being on display,
yes,
being quite dexterous,
yes,
having to communicate with your body,
yes,
move around pieces of furniture on a stage. So that just seems quite bold, actually.
Well, Jessie wasn't diagnosed with dyspraxia until I was already in the profession. I got my first equity job and found out I was pregnant in the same week. So the die was cast in terms of what I was going to do for a job. But it has meant that, if I'm on a rake stage, I will say, no thank you to the heels. I beg you, no heels, because I will fall over. If I have props, do not give them to me at the last minute. I have to practice with them so that klaxons can go off and my hands will still do the thing. Because if my brain gets involved in that, it will all go everywhere.
And were you operating on pretend people in Casualty?
I really hope they were pretend.
They were kind volunteers. Yes,
That's quite funny, isn't it? The
Yeah.
scalpel in one hand.
I was a mere sister, so nobody was. I was going to give reassuring words and do the red dots, the dots, the traffic light dots, for putting on the monitors. That was the only thing I could remember for a while, and now it's gone.
Okay.
It's gone.
You were also, I remember, is it? I need to get the title right. The BBC Radio Drama Company.
Yes, the
Troupe.
RDC.
The RDC. Oh, sorry, darling.
Yes,
the
darling,
RDC.
the
The RDC.
Now, did you? What was that like? That experience? 'Cause
I'm a radio dweeb.
okay.
Yes, my father is he's a avid World Service listener. So I would wake in the night as a kid, and I would hear the World Service coming through the floor. So Radio 4 was the light programme, and then Radio 4 were on literally in every room of the house. And so I can't start the day without the wireless on. So I've always listened to everything. And the first thing I did a show called Citizens, which was,
it was like a
do you remember
soap opera?
Citizens?
Yes.
It was like the Archers in London,
Yes.
or the Accent Show, as we called it. Everybody lived in a shared house, and there was a Geordie, a Scots person, somebody from Welsh Wales. It was one of those.
Yes.
And I did it for 2.5 years, and I was beside
What kind of a person were you? By the
I
way?
was JJ.
Right.
I was a bit of a ball breaker. Yes. One of those, you come in dynamic and they don't quite know what to do with you.
Right.
And
That's Radio 4 for you, by the way. But anyway,
thank you. Especially if you're a mighty woman. But interestingly, one of the producers from Citizens is now playing Hastings in our show, Clive Brill.
There we are.
So full circle. I loved the RDC. When I started on the RDC, I think the first time I was on it was the late 80s. There was a company of over 30. John Tidyman took you into his office. Red wine was cracked open to celebrate your arrival, and you all staggered out at the end of the afternoon. By the time now, I workshop potential actors going into the RDC, and the company, I think it's down to about 6 or 7. So like a lot of things at the BBC, they've sort of shrunk.
Yeah.
We were much taller when we joined.
Were you?
Yeah,
Yes,
literally
I've
shrank when
5'10"
we
I
were
was.
there. Yeah.
Gosh.
Do you worry at all that artificial intelligence and the development of technology might actually take quite a large proportion of acting work away from people? Because it suddenly strikes me that you could now form a whole play, couldn't you, out of just using some examples of your voice. You would be able to turn that into future dialogue, wouldn't you?
You could, but and I'm sure they will. But I think there's something about the vibration bouncing back and forth between people in a room that is qualitatively different. Like I'm really glad to be in a studio talking to you two when we can all look at each other and we're all actually responding to each other because we're in the same space. And it's different when it's mediated, through a screen or at a distance. And I do think that's the case, with a radio play. Of course, your cues and you rehearse it, but there is something that's very in the moment and of the moment that is a human resonance. And I think humans pick it up when they listen to it.
People will be asking, why haven't they asked her about Bridgerton? So we're going to do it now.
Go on then.
I had not been aware of the books, I must admit, so I came to the show. Had you heard? Because you're a Booker Prize judge.
I'm a judge this year. Yeah.
So books
yeah.
are your thing.
Yes.
Very much so. You're
Yeah.
a great narrator of books, aren't
Yeah.
you, as well? So what had you read any of the Bridgerton stuff?
I hadn't even heard of them. I mean, it was a brand new thing for me. The framework of the books certainly is there to frame the structure of the series. But then, it's got the Shonda what if by just plonking Queen Charlotte in the middle of it and saying, OK, so if we're going to run with the idea of Queen Charlotte having some African heritage in her, which is documented, then let's expand that that romantic Regency world and have a look at what if that's true, what about the other people of colour that may have been in the mix at the time, of which there were many, and see what we do with that. So yeah, I came to the show because you never see a whole script, you just get your sides. So I came to the show really through Lady Danbury, and the sides I got to look at for her, I just read them and went, yep, I can do something with her. and there's an energy and a dynamism about her, and I think of, my nana giving birth during an air raid in the basement of the Salvation Army Hospital in Liverpool, and my aunt in Ghana in 1969 getting on a plane with empty suitcases and going to New York and Paris and Milan and London because she loved fashion and she wanted to open a shop in Accra. I just think of all these fabulous, dynamic women who, may not have easy lives, but they make the best of them, and they're still fabulous, and they laugh with their friends and they commiserate with I just wanted to celebrate those women, and I sort of feel like Lady Danbury was a good space to do that with.
And the makeup, the fuss around it, the wigs, the amount of time you have to spend. This is graft, isn't it? I mean, how does it differ to Shakespeare, to playing Richard III?
Well, for me, if the character is interesting and good, I'm happy, and I don't care what the medium is. It can be an audiobook, or it can be radio, or it can be a film, whatever, or theatre. The difference in the prep is the stone cold horror and fear just before curtain up. When you go in and you have to go to the end, and if you get yourself in a mess, we can't go again. Dig yourself out of that hole, my friend. The Lady Danbury, the alarm clock goes off at 3:30 in the morning, and you're thinking, oh God, no, I beg you. And then you fall into the car, and then you sit in a makeup chair for 3 hours, and you come out as Lady Danbury. So, and then you put a wig on, and then you can't then you put a corset on rather, and then you can't lie down and you can't bend down, and you better have a 5-10 minute warning if you need a pee, because it's a mission, all that sort of stuff.
Do you know what? You're absolutely describing Jane's day.
Pretty much.
Tiny final question from me, and I'm sure Jane has something that she'd like to ask you too. You said something so clever about the over 40s woman as a consumer of the arts.
Yes.
They download and stream the most podcasts and radio, but the people who are paying the most attention are receiving the least attention.
Yes.
Which is such a canny way of putting it. What would you like to hear and see more of? Us, women of our age, women with our delights and our experiences and our continuing appetite for life. I mean, I expect to have a good 3 decades yet to go.
Working as well.
Oh, please, God, no. Please let me stop at some point.
Well, not necessarily.
I want to dig the bulbs up, and have a gin and sit about. But I want to see our stories. It's almost like we're still in that space of going, if your womb can't push out a baby, we're no longer interested in you. I want to see women with white hair reading the news. I want to see the truth.
Yeah, that hasn't happened, has it?
Has it? No, it hasn't.
It hasn't happened in Britain, and it should. You're absolutely right. Yeah. My final question was actually going to be, how can anyone take themselves seriously when Richard III was eventually found buried under a car park?
Well, that's what happens, doesn't it?
That's showbiz.
The great get dug up in Leicester in a car park. That's what happens.
If you enjoyed that, what should people do?
Well, the best thing would be if you could listen to us on Times Radio, Monday to Thursday, 3 till 5, Jane and Fee.